Hey, what if you want to run the same block of code multiple times? Well, that's what we've got loops for. So loops allow us to iterate through the content multiple times and run various blocks of code. So this is just how we can iterate through and make use of a block of code. There's different types of loops. So the most common one and most basic one is the for loop. So let's create one of the for loops. We set a value for the initial state of x. And then we're going to loop through while this condition is going to be true until the condition is true. So once it's false, then we break out of the loop. So it's no longer going to continue to iterate. And then we find a way to break out, so we increment x by 1. Now this is what's known as a for loop. And this first statement is executed one time. And then this one is the second statement is the one that's going to define the condition for executing the block of code and also for stopping the execution of the block of code. And then the last statement here, where we're incrementing x by 1, is executed every time the block of code runs, and it allows us to increment the value of x and eventually break out of the loop. So now within the console, we'll log out the value of x. So we can run it and we can set the end value of the loop to whatever we want. We can also set the beginning value of the loop to whatever we want that as well. And notice that it always does run that first time. So setting the first value of x when it runs adds to x all the way to 14. And then just before it hits 15, that's where it breaks. If you do so less than or equal to 15, so that's going to allow us to continue to iterate through until we actually hit 15. So that would give us that one extra loop through while we're doing the loop, because that condition is still going to be true. And if we want to run up to 14, then we just equal it to less than 14. So there are a few different types of loops. There's also the while loop and the do while loop. So let's check those out. So let's set a starting value for y and set it to 0. And then we're going to loop while the value of y is less than, how about we put 10? And then the block of code that we want to run, the same as the for loop, we see it within the curly brackets. So we need to output, we need to have some type of code running in here. Just going to simply do a simple output into the console. And we also need a way for our way out of the loop. So that's where we're going to increment y by 1. And so this will be different of affecting the output depending on where we increment y. So in this case, we're starting out at 1 because we're incrementing y before we're outputting. And it initially starts out at 0, and then it runs all the way to 10, and then the condition is no longer true, so that breaks that condition. So if we put y after, we're going to start at 0, so that was the default value for y. Let me update this to be 5. Let me update this to be 5, and I'll also update this to be afterwards so that we can see that they can all run roughly the same way. So starting out at 0, running to 4, meets the condition less than 5. Once it hits 5, then it stops. Same thing for the while loop. And then lastly, there's also the do while loop. So this provides us another way to create a loop. And there's various scenarios why you would do one loop over the other. So the do loop will always run at least one time the block of code. So we set while, and then we need our way out of our loop while z is less than 5. And I'll update the starting numbers to see what type of a difference we're going to make. So here we're going to increment the value of z. And then we'll console log out the value of z as well. So just as we did in the while loop. So it looks the same. Everything looks the same. Now let's do an update and update the values. So none of the conditions are going to come out as true. So do you think any of these are going to run? And let's do a refresh. And we see that one of them ran, and that's the do loop. So this one will always run no matter what, at least one time, because the condition is afterwards. So it will run the code, and then afterwards it will realize that, okay, well, I need to stop. I'm not going to continue with this loop because this condition is no longer true. So if you want it to run at least one time, use the do loop, and also you can use the while loop or the for loop, depending on what your preference is and what your code requires. Loops are an ideal way to loop through the contents of an array. So let's create our array, and then we're going to loop through the contents that are contained within the array. So we'll just give it a variable name of array1, and then populate some content in here. And I'm just doing some quick content so that we have something within our array. And we know from the arrays, when we list out the array properties, we have a length value for the array. So that gives us a number to work with that tells us how many items are within the array. So that's where we can use a for loop in order to loop through the items of the array, and then we can output them into the console. So let's set our starting value of x is 0. And this is where we set 0 because we know that the first item in the array has an index value of 0. And we want to loop through while x is less than the value of the array. And then as we increment, or the value of the array length, and this is going to be a value of 4. So it's going to continue to, or it's going to be a value of 5 because the length is 5 and the last index value is 4. So starting at 0 is ideal. And then we just need to increment x, so that allows us our way out of the loop. So as we go through and we iterate, x is going to increment, and that will give us a way out eventually of the loop. So let's use console log, and then we'll use x to define the index value that we want to output into the console. So that gives us a quick way to loop through the contents of the array. There's also the for each, which is usually a preferred way to loop through the contents of the array. So let's output that as well. So taking the array and then using the for each method, and this is an array method, we're going to create a function, and then also do it with the arrow function, the arrow format. So we've got the elements, we've got the index, so the element is going to be whatever the item is within the array, and then we can also return back the array itself. So we've got all of these values that we can work with, and obviously that array1, we can always reference that back. So we've got a number of ways to output the contents. So by default, and you don't actually need all of these additional parameters, you can just run with the 1. So what happens now is that I'm missing actually a closing bracket. So that was within the function. Let's add in the closing bracket and refresh again. So that again lists out the contents of the array. Also, there's a number of other ways that we can do it. So we can select the array1 and use its index value that as we're looping through, because we do get index as well. So that's one way that we can get it. We can also console log, and this is all going to reference, so we can take from the array, get whatever the index value is, and that will once again provide us another way to output the contents using the for each. So also let's do it with the arrow format, so the for each, and this is going to be a cleaner way to create the array loop. So within here, and then we can return back whatever the contents are that we want for this loop. So let's use L as well. And then if we want to just console L, we can do that. So we can basically do that within the one line. And that's this one here that's running at the end. So allowing us to loop through the arrays. And there's also one other way to do it. So there's quite a few ways to get the contents of the array. And again, depending on what the code is and how you want to use it, that's the one that you could select. And some developers will prefer one over the other. There's also the for, so we can look at each element in array and console log the element or the item value. So this is returning back the index value. So using the index value, we can associate it with the element or the array. So that gives us an opportunity to do it kind of similar between a combination of what we did with the for loop, where we're doing a for and we're doing x while there's items within the array, and then we're looping through. So that was initially getting the index value, but if we want to get the value, then we can return it back that way. So try it out and try the different ways, create a nice simple array, and then output the contents of the array onto the page, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. Hey, this lesson we're going to construct a quick object and then loop through the contents of the object. So let's make our object first, and we want to loop through whatever contents we have within the object. I'm going to define a few values. So we've got first, and we've got a name, last, so some properties, and then associate some values with those properties and update that. So we don't need a whole lot. So just this gives us a way to loop through the contents of the object. And we'll just do a quick demo of those. So using the for and selecting from the object. So let's and we'll get the property. So we're picking up the property names from the object. And we'll just call it prop in my object. And we'll loop through them. So output in the console, prop, so whatever we're picking up within this for loop. And then if we actually want to get the content, the value of the property, then this is where we need to reference the my object. And in the square brackets, we're going to specify the property. And we do the square brackets because in case some of these property names might have spaces or they might not be compatible with dot notation, that's why we'll do it that way. So let's refresh. And so this is our quick way to get the property name. So it's first, and then the value associated with that property, Lawrence, last, Svekis, age, 30. So that's a quick way to loop through the contents of an object. So go ahead, try it, create an object, and then loop through the contents of the object to get more familiar with how you can iterate the contents of objects.